Usually, what key a piece of music is in is a fairly simple question to answer. However, when it comes to Radiohead's Karma Police, it's not that clean cut. What is clear though is that Karma Police has three distinct sections. The verse, the chorus,
this is what you'll get,
and the coda or outro section. Now, as for what key each of these sections is in, I largely hear the coda in B minor, although we will talk about that later. The chorus is fairly unambiguously in the key of G major, but when it comes to the verse of Karma Police, the key really isn't that clear, to the point that it's been the subject of various arguments on Reddit and various academic articles. There's basically two different perspectives when it comes to the key of Karma Police's verse. Some people hear it in the key of A minor, or to be more precise, A Dorian. So this means A is the root note and will sound resolved when I play it over the top of the song like this. But others, including Barnaby from the brilliant YouTube channel Listening In, hear it in the key of E minor. To me, I largely hear the root note to be A, but it does kind of depend on where in the verse I'm listening. At this point in the verse, it certainly sounds like A is the root to me. But at this point, E can start to feel like the root. It's actually a bit like an optical illusion, where one moment I can see it one way, but then, particularly if I concentrate, my perception can flip, and then I suddenly see it the other way. So how is it possible that different listeners are hearing the same piece of music in different keys? They're hearing different notes as the root note. Have they just got bad ears? Well, no. Sometimes the root note of a piece of music can be a little subjective. If we look at the notes that Karma Police's verse is using, apart from this brief moment here, all the notes belong to the E natural minor scale. So the key is E minor, right? Well, not necessarily. See, the notes of Karma Police's verse also largely fit into the scale of A Dorian. So is the key A Dorian? Well, once again, not necessarily. There are actually 7 different scales that the notes of this verse would fit into. All 7 of those scales, including E minor and A Dorian, use the exact same 7 notes in the exact same order, the only difference being which note they treat as the root note. They are all modes of each other. They are the 7 modes of the G major scale. So we know that the verse of Karma Police is based on A mode of the G major scale, but to work out which mode, we need to decide which note is the root note. The root note of a piece of music is decided by context. That's what allows modes to exist. The same 7 notes can sound like G major, or E minor, or A Dorian, all depending on the context in which we hear them. And, well, in the verse of Karma Police, there are some elements that seem to point to A as the root note, and some that point to E. For example, each verse begins on an A minor chord. So this kind of sets A as the root note by default, as it's the first tonal centre we hear in the progression and in the entire song. But songs don't have to start on the root note, and only one bar after this A minor chord, we then get a D chord resolving to an E minor chord, which can make E sound like the root. If we look at the vocal melody in isolation, to me it often seems like it's resolving down to A. For example, this first line, when it reaches the B natural, it seems to then want to resolve down to A at the end, suggesting that A is the root note of the melody. In fact, when you look at the vocal melody like this, with all of the chords removed, it really does start looking like A minor. And not even A Dorian, because the vocal melody doesn't actually feature the 6th degree, that is the difference between A minor and A Dorian. So it does make me wonder that maybe the vocal melody is effectively in A minor, but the chord progression is shifting the perception towards E minor, so we meet in the middle with this A Dorian sound. Now, I should mention that there is one moment of the verse where, rather than the F sharp we've had so far, we briefly get an F natural instead. But this doesn't really sway the argument towards A or E. If we're considering A to be the root, then this switch to F natural turns A Dorian into A natural minor. But if we're hearing E as the root, then this is just a brief moment of E Phrygian in an otherwise E minor verse. Whereas in most songs, the context provided by the music makes one note sound unambiguously like the root note, in the verse of Karma Police, although the context does narrow it down to either E or A, there isn't really enough context to decisively say whether the root note is E or A. So therefore, there isn't one ultimate answer to what key is the verse of Karma Police in. With music that's in modes, with modal music, there's always an element of fluidity with the root note, but this is part of what gives modal music its sound. If you've ever looked in the comment section to any of my videos about modes, you'll always find somebody hearing a piece of music in a different key. And it's not like they're wrong or I'm wrong, sometimes there is more than one answer to what key a piece of music is in. Unlike what we might call tonal music, where through the use of clear cadences and progressions, the root of the key is almost 100% clear, with modal music, it can often feel like we're hanging between different key centres. Almost like as the music progresses, we're swinging like a pendulum between two potential root notes. The modes aren't as stable as the more conventional tonal scales, like the major scale or the harmonic minor. Modes leave space for ambiguity and subjectiveness when it comes to their key centre. It's a bit like tonal music is a realist portrait, where the subject of the image really isn't up for debate. Whereas, like I mentioned earlier, modal music is an optical illusion, where subtle changes in context can change our perception of the subject. Now, so far, we've only really discussed Karma Police's verse, but there is even more modal goodness happening in these other two sections. What I think is really interesting is how the tonality of Karma Police's verse connects with the tonality of the chorus. See, on this diagram, I've made it look like there's a key change happening from each verse to each chorus. But actually, this change would be better described as a mode change. Regardless of whether the verse is in A Dorian or E minor, what is clear is that it uses a mode of G major. So, when Karma Police reaches its chorus, it doesn't change the notes it's using like it would in a key change, it just changes which of those notes sounds like the root note. Once we hit the chorus, rather than E or A sounding like the root, G sounds like the root note.
This is what you get.
The switch to G major is established by the vocal melody, which climbs up from D to F sharp and then resolves to G, accompanied by the three main chords of the key of G major, the 4th C, the 5th D, and the tonic chord G. Now, I should mention that this G is followed by this fairly stark F sharp chord that doesn't fit into the key of G major, but this is just a chromatic chord, a chord that isn't diatonic to the key, but just adds some spice to the tonality. Now, the last part of Karma Police that we need to talk about is the outro or coda section. Like I mentioned before, I hear this section as being in the key of B minor. But just like with the verse of Karma Police, not everyone is on the same page. Although some agree with my ears and say it's in B minor, others say it's in D major. B minor is a mode of D major. It's actually what we call the relative minor of D major. It uses all of the same notes as D major, but treats B as the root. And to be honest, although I do hear B as the root note at these points in the coda, during this stretch of chords, it does actually start to sound like D is the root. Deciding definitively whether this section is in B minor or D major, or whether the verse is in A Dorian or E minor, isn't only near impossible, but it's also unnecessary. Particularly when it comes to keys that are relative minor or major to each other, like D major and B minor, they basically are the same key as each other. We even give them the exact same key signature because they use the exact same notes. And this can even be true for music in other modes. Music in A Dorian will sometimes be written down with the same key signature as E minor, as they both use the same notes. They are two sides of the same key. If you've got this far in the video, then you must be a Radiohead fan. So I think you'll be really interested in Listening In. Listening In is an amazing channel that makes stunning videos about music, often about Radiohead. In fact, this video is actually made in collaboration with Listening In, and they've just released a brand new video about Radiohead. So I highly recommend that you go watch that video right now, and do leave a comment telling Barnaby that I sent you. Of course, do let me know in the comments which key you hear Karma Police's verse in, which note you think is the root note, because I'd really like to find out how subjective this is. And thank you as always to all of the wonderful people who support me on Patreon, including the names you see on screen right now, and Abigail Allen, Andre Sainz Diaja, Andrew Brown, Andrew Sussman, Austin Barrett, Austin Russell, Bob McKinstry, Brittany Parker, Cameron Oliveda, Colin Aiken, Chris Cabell, Christopher Ryan, David Rivers, Donald Howard, Dr. Darren Wicks, Elena Skorchenko, Esben Hansen, Eugene Leroy, FD Hodor, Guillermo Latona, Hamish Brocklebank, Hugo Miller, James Ko, J.A. Kokensparger, John Dye, Jonas Soderstrom, Justin Vigor, Lavender Monrose, Mark Height, Mark Ziegenhagen, Max O'Keefe, Melody Composer Squared, Melanie Schonert, Michael Vivian, Nancy Gillard, Nathan Lawrence, Nathaniel Park, Paul Miller, Paul Pazel, Peter Dunphy, Piotr Shmanovsky, Roger Clay, Sam Lynn, Scott Fenley, Sean Kennedy, Steve Daly, Stephen Lazaro, Tim Beaker, Trisha Adams, Tim Payne, Toot, Victor Levy, Vidad Flowers, Vladimir Kodakov, and Volti.